A helicopter drops out of the sky at the home of cricket. A Texan billionaire steps out, unveiling a case that holds $20 million in cash. Months later, when the tournament he paid for lights up an island stadium, the crowd doesn't boo him. They roar his name. For one night, Allen Stanford is the most beloved man in the Caribbean. He's about to hand these players the richest single payday in the sport's history. But here's the line. Nobody in that stadium can hear yet. Every dollar being celebrated tonight was already gone. Welcome to Tycoons and Traitors. Empires built on nerve, and the greed that brought them down. He wasn't born rich. Allen Stanford grew up in small-town Texas, the grandson of an insurance man, and made his first fortune buying distressed real estate cheap during the 1980s Houston bust. But real estate wasn't the empire. In the 1980s, he opened a small offshore bank on the island of Montserrat. And when regulators there started asking questions, he simply moved the whole operation to a friendlier island, Antigua. There he built Stanford International Bank and sold something almost too simple to refuse. Certificates of deposit paying steady returns well above any US bank, marketed again and again as being as safe as an insured American account. For thousands of savers, especially across Latin America, it looked like the safety of a bank, back home with the upside of a hedge fund. Money poured in. Retirees, business owners, entire families put their savings into Stanford's CDs, until, by the SEC's own count, an estimated $7 billion had come in from tens of thousands of depositors, spread across more than 100 countries. It became one of the largest Ponzi schemes ever uncovered on American soil. By the 2000s, Stanford wasn't hiding any of this. He owned private jets, a fleet of homes across Texas, Florida, and the Caribbean, and a growing reputation as a philanthropist funding hospitals, schools, and disaster relief. Forbes put him on its list of America's richest people. He gave interviews about discipline and hard work. The bank quietly funding all of it looked, to nearly everyone watching, like just another Allen Stanford success story. Here's the mechanism, in one sentence. The returns were fiction. Statements were fabricated. Real investment income was a fraction of what was promised. And new depositors' money was what actually paid the old ones. That's the lie. But the lie alone doesn't explain how it survived 2 decades without a single regulator shutting it down. Here's what does. Antigua's financial regulator, the body legally responsible for auditing Stanford's bank, was led by a man named Leroy King. According to US prosecutors, King was effectively on Stanford's payroll. Cash payments, gifts, and favors changed hands over years. In return, prosecutors say, King buried inconvenient audits and quietly warned Stanford whenever outside regulators started asking questions. Stanford didn't need to hide his fraud from the regulator. Therefore, he simply owned the regulator. And the capture didn't stop at one office. In 2006, the government of Antigua and Barbuda knighted him for his contribution to the local economy. He became, in name, Sir Allen Stanford, an Antiguan honor, not a British one, but he wore it like royalty. Then came the cricket. Stanford poured tens of millions into the sport across the Caribbean, and in 2008 staged the Stanford Super Series, a winner-take-all 2020 match with a $20 million purse, the richest single game in the sport's history. To a region that had adopted him as a hero and a patron, he wasn't a banker under scrutiny. He was the man who'd put Caribbean cricket on the world stage, which meant something dangerous. To question Sir Allen didn't feel like due diligence. It felt like turning on the man who'd made an entire island proud of itself. He hadn't hidden his fraud. He'd made an audience cheer for it. If a fraud built on buying the very people meant to catch it is new to you, a like genuinely helps this reach more people who'd want to see it. Outside Antigua, though, a handful of analysts kept noticing something odd. Stanford's returns were too smooth. Real markets move up and down. His CDs, year after year, barely wavered, as if the numbers were being written, not earned. In January 2009, an independent financial analyst, named Alex Dalmurdy, published a report picking apart those numbers, spreadsheet by spreadsheet. He wasn't a regulator, and he wasn't an employee. He was an outsider with a calculator, and he was one of the first people to say, in public, what no regulator in Antigua ever had. The math simply didn't work. By weeks later, that oddity had reached the desks of American regulators, who answered to nobody in Antigua at all. On February 17, 2009, the SEC filed civil fraud charges and moved to freeze Stanford's empire. Federal agents raided his Houston offices, treating the place like a crime scene, sealing files, seizing drives, locking the doors behind them. His jets were grounded, his accounts frozen. The offshore fortress that had shielded him for 20 years was suddenly on the wrong side of a US courtroom, and this time, Antigua alone couldn't protect him. He tried to hire a private jet back to his island fortress that same week, but his credit card was declined. The SEC had already frozen his accounts. He was tracked down days later, not on a plane home, but at his girlfriend's family home in Virginia. In 2012, a jury convicted him on 13 of 14 counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 110 years, one of the longest terms ever handed down in a financial fraud case. Leroy King, the regulator, fought extradition from Antigua for a decade before finally facing American justice himself. But unlike Bernie Madoff's victims, many of whom eventually recovered a large share of their losses through a court-ordered fund, Stanford's depositors, many of them ordinary savers across Latin America, have largely never gotten their money back. Over a decade later, receivers are still chasing what's left of $7 billion. And Leroy King, the regulator who was paid to look away, eventually pleaded guilty himself and walked away with a sentence measured in years, not decades. The man who bought the referee got 110 years. The referee who sold the call got a fraction of that. If you want more stories about the empires that got caught and the systems that let them get away with it for years, subscribe to Tycoons and Traitors. Bernie Madoff hid his fraud in silence, behind closed doors for decades. Allen Stanford did the opposite. He built his in daylight, in floodlights, in a knighthood, in a stadium full of cheering fans, because he'd already bought the one person whose job was to stop him. So which is actually harder to catch, the fraud that hides from the referee, or the one that simply buys him? That's a question no regulator once asked out loud. If it's worth asking in your comments, we'd like to hear your answer. And a like and a subscribe help more people find out too.